Always appears to me that the more important the issue, the less it gets discussed here in the Congress and in the media. More important, less discussion. And today I want to say a few words about one of those issues, and that is the ongoing and unprecedented humanitarian disaster which is taking place in Gaza and which is getting worse every single day. On October 7th, as I think we all know, Hamas went forward with a brutal terrorist attack against Israel, killing 12,000 innocent people, and they took 230 hostages, some 100 of whom are still in captivity. And in my view, as I've said many times, Israel had the right to respond to that attack and go after Hamas. But what Israel did not have the right to do and does not have the right to do is to go to war against the entire Palestinian people, which is exactly what has occurred. Mr. President, when I talk about issues that we in Congress do not fully engage in, discuss, appreciate, what we are talking about is that in Gaza right now, some 30,000 Palestinians have been killed and more than 70,000 have been injured since that war began. This is a country, an area of 2.2 million people. 2/3 of those who have been killed or injured are women and children. Unbelievably, and I think this is another point that is not discussed very often, 1.7 million Palestinians, 80% of the population, 80% of the population of Gaza have been driven from their homes. So men, women, and children driven from their homes with no safe place to go and no idea as to whether or not they will ever return to their communities. Imagine that for a moment. Little kids, 5 years old, 3 years old, they don't know what's going on. Bombs falling, pushed out of their homes. They don't know where they're going or whether, in fact, they will ever return to their communities. Mr. President, the bombing of Gaza, and again, it must be talked about over and over again, is almost unprecedented in modern history. 70% of the housing units in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. Let me repeat that. 70% of the housing units in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. Mr. President, the civilian infrastructure of Gaza has been devastated. There is virtually no electricity. There are few supplies of clean water. There is not one functional hospital for 2.2 million residents of Gaza. There is not enough food, not enough water, not enough fuel, and not enough medicine. And increasingly, for the people of Gaza, there is no hope. Mr. President, this is a horrific reality, and I know here in the Senate we deal with a lot of stuff, but this is a reality that cannot be ignored. It must be dealt with. The catastrophe unfolding in Gaza today, right now, as we speak, is among the worst humanitarian disasters in modern history. And while this body was in recess, we had a 2-week break. While we were safely with our families, the urgency of this crisis only increased. We are truly approaching a point of no return. For months, the United Nations and other aid organizations have warned that the constant bombing and the restrictions on humanitarian aid entering Gaza raise the risk of famine and disease. 2 months ago, the UN warned that the whole population of Gaza was hungry. People were going hungry. And that more than 500,000 people faced the most severe category of food insecurity. That's a fancy terminology for talking about people in desperate need of food. Mr. President, now, today, the worst of those fears are becoming reality. Hundreds of thousands of children in Gaza, beautiful little kids, are starving to death. Last week, the World Food Program reported that nutrition screenings found that 1 in 6 children under the age of 12 in northern Gaza are acutely malnourished, and 3% are experiencing child wasting, a terrible, terrible term that describes the destruction of human life for kids. These children will die without urgent treatment. In other words, if all of the aid in the world came in tomorrow, many hundreds of thousands of children in Gaza have been permanently damaged. Malnutrition in children causes cognitive and emotional distress, physical distress. So let us contemplate that. Let us think about that for a moment. If nothing changes, in the coming weeks, thousands of children in Gaza will begin to die of starvation and easily preventable diseases caused by the lack of food, medicine, and clean drinking water. Was this a natural catastrophe? Was this a storm? Was this an earthquake? No. This is a man-made disaster. Already, some 90% of children under 5 in Gaza have 1 or more infectious diseases, according to the UN, and 70% have had diarrhea in the past 2 weeks due to a lack of clean drinking water. This is an urgent humanitarian crisis. It cannot be ignored. It must be addressed. Without an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and an urgent expansion of the relief effort, even more people could end up dying from the lack of basic supplies that have been killed in the bombardment. In other words, what we're looking at is thousands of people have died from the bombs, and now you're going to see more people die from starvation and diseases as a result of no clean water or sanitation. Scientists at Johns Hopkins University recently modeled what could happen over the next 6 months if nothing changes, and concluded that some 85,000 more people could die in Gaza over that period from war and disease. Mr. President, we cannot allow this disaster to continue. And let us be clear why this is happening. And it is happening because Israel is simply not letting in enough aid, not enough food, not enough water, not enough medical supplies, not enough fuel. It is not more complicated than that. This is a man-made crisis caused by Israel, and it can be changed tomorrow. Israeli restrictions on aid entering Gaza mean that only a tiny fraction of the food, water, medicine, and fuel that is needed can get into Gaza. Even then, once aid gets in, Israeli bombing and military activities mean that very little of that aid can reach beyond the immediate area around the Rafah border Rafah border crossing from Egypt. And what that means is that some of the most desperate areas of Gaza, that in those areas virtually no aid can get through at all. So it's not only that aid is not getting in, what aid is getting in is not going to those locations where it is needed the most. Mr. President, even more distressing, aid convoys have been turned back or fired upon even after previously clearing their route with the Israeli military. In other words, the aid people tell the Israeli military where they are going, and the result of that is they in fact get bombed. Bottom line, despite the urgency of this crisis and the growing starvation of the people of Gaza, humanitarian access has actually gotten worse in recent weeks. About 80 trucks per day have gotten into Gaza over the last 3 weeks, down by roughly 40% from earlier periods. Before the war, before the homelessness, and before the starvation, some 500 trucks per day delivered basic necessities into Gaza. Almost all aid deliveries to northern Gaza have been suspended. The Israeli government has rejected most requests for access to the north, and the situation has become too dangerous for aid to be safely delivered. And the reason that aid delivery has become increasingly dangerous is that the Israeli military has shown little regard for the safety of humanitarian operations. Quite the contrary, earlier this month, the Israeli military fired on a UN food aid convoy, even though it had previously cleared its route and timing with the Israelis. And here is something that I hope every American hears, that up until now, since this war began, 161 UN staff and at least 340 health workers have been killed in Israeli attacks since October 7th. In other words, the people who are trying to help the desperate, people are trying to deliver aid, people are trying to provide health care, they are being killed in large numbers. The situation today is obviously desperate and getting more and more desperate. And as an indication of that desperation, humanitarian aid trucks that do get through to northern Gaza have been mobbed by starving people. That is the reality. When a truck manages to get through, aid is not distributed in an orderly way. Hungry people are mobbing the trucks to grab food to feed their kids. The UN's leading expert on access to food this week said Israel is intentionally denying access to food. Mr. President, that is a war crime. Unbelievably, in the midst of this humanitarian cataclysm, rather than work to improve coordination with the UN and get basic supplies to Palestinians in the war zone, there has been a concerted attack on UNRWA, the largest UN agency operating in Gaza and the backbone of the humanitarian aid operation. They're the ones who do the lion's share of the work in getting humanitarian aid to the civilian population. UNRWA runs schools, healthcare, water sanitation, and food assistance for Palestinians in Gaza, as well as the West Bank and the wider region. Israel has accused 12 UNRWA employees of taking part in the October 7th attack. 12 employees. This is a serious allegation, and it is being investigated seriously. But, Mr. President, you don't starve 2 million people because of the alleged actions of 12 UNRWA employees out of a total workforce of 30,000. Despite UNRWA's indispensable role in addressing this unprecedented humanitarian disaster, Congress is now considering legislation, Senate passed legislation, that would actually prohibit funding for this agency, which would only make a horrible situation even worse. Children are starving. People don't have water. People don't have medical supplies. The agency that historically has done the work getting aid out to people is now being unfunded. The U.S. decision to pause its funding for UNRWA has left the agency at a breaking point. Mr. President, that decision must be reconsidered immediately. And Mr. President, that brings us to the United States' role in this crisis, because the point is, what we are not just looking at is some distant part of the world where terrible things are happening and we're just learning about it and we had nothing to do with it. Quite the contrary. Put simply, Mr. President, we are deeply complicit in the humanitarian disaster and the horror that is taking place in Gaza today. Most of the bombs and most of the military equipment that the Israeli government is using in Gaza is provided by the United States and subsidized by American taxpayers. This is not just an Israeli war. This is an American war as well. We are providing the weapons for Netanyahu to wage this war. Mr. President, I met earlier today with human rights experts from Amnesty International. Amnesty researchers have painstakingly documented the use of U.S. weapons in numerous Israeli strikes that break the international laws of war. Most recently, Amnesty documented 4 unlawful strikes in Rafah in December, January, that killed at least 95 civilians, including 42 children, and some of those attacks were done with U.S. weapons. Mr. President, the U.S. has laws on the books intended to prevent these kinds of human rights violations that are being done with U.S.-provided weapons. The problem is that we have very rarely enforced them with any country, and we've never enforced them with Israel. For months, as I think all of us know, President Biden has been trying to get Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and his extreme right-wing government to scale back the indiscriminate bombing. So far, Netanyahu has not changed his tactics, and in fact, humanitarian access has actually deteriorated. The situation is getting worse. Netanyahu makes polite sounds when U.S. officials visit him in Israel, and then he proceeds to do exactly what he wants. And what he wants increasingly seems to be the wholesale destruction of Gaza. Mr. President, the United States is now focused on negotiating a ceasefire agreement that would allow for massive humanitarian aid and the freeing of the remaining hostages. I desperately hope that this deal comes together. I trust that all of us want the killing to stop and the hostages to be freed. But once again, despite what President Biden is fighting for, Netanyahu is resisting. It appears that he and his extreme right-wing government are trying to prolong this war to hold on to their power and to avoid accountability. President Biden has repeatedly said that the only viable path to lasting peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike is a two-state solution. I agree. But of course, Netanyahu has made it very clear that he is completely opposed to that outcome, and he has been opposed to that outcome for his entire political career. Mr. President, on issue after issue, Prime Minister Netanyahu is deeply opposed to the goals of the United States. We want civilian life protected. He doesn't seem to care. We want more aid getting into Gaza. He won't allow it. We want a two-state solution. He is vigorously opposed. Mr. President, given all of that reality, given the fact that at every aspect of this crisis, Netanyahu disagrees with what the United States government wants to see happen, it is beyond comprehension as to why the United States is preparing to send another $10 billion in unrestricted military aid so that Netanyahu can continue the murderous campaign that we oppose. Enough is enough. The United States cannot continue to be complicit in Netanyahu's war crimes. No more military aid for Israel. Whether Netanyahu likes it or not, the United States must continue working toward an urgent humanitarian ceasefire to allow for the release of the hostages and massive influx of humanitarian aid. We should join other countries all over the world to pass a ceasefire resolution at the UN Security Council that includes the release of the hostages and full humanitarian access, as previous drafts have done. The United States should begin the process of recognizing the state of Palestine as a full UN member state. This is both a fact, Palestine is a nation recognized by 139 UN member states, and a moral imperative in the face of what amounts to illegal Israeli annexation. President Biden should also make clear that he will not release any additional military funding for Israel without firm commitments that the ceasefire will be honored unless broken by Hamas, and that full humanitarian access will be ensured, that funds for the Palestinian Authority will be released, and that illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied territories will cease. Mr. President, none of this will be easy. But to my mind, it is absolutely morally unacceptable that the United States continue its complicity in the humanitarian disaster that is taking place in Gaza right now. The time is now to say no to the right-wing extremist government of Netanyahu. No more money for the Israeli military. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.